I know this may be considered a hot take in the comments section, but I honestly think that Vancouver, BC has the best transit system in Canada and the US. Maybe it's a bit of hometown bias as I spent most of my childhood there, but Vancouver has objectively excellent transit. The most famous part of this is SkyTrain, with extremely high-frequency rapid transit covering massive parts of the Metro Vancouver region. However, there's much more to the equation. Metro Vancouver has an incredibly strong bus network, providing high-frequency service to the vast majority of the region with only minimal gaps. The network also runs late into the evening, and a network of night buses take over when SkyTrain and regular bus routes stop running. Vancouver also has the C-Bus, connecting two sides of the Burrard Inlet with frequent passenger ferries, and the West Coast Express, the often forgotten commuter rail service connecting Vancouver with Mission. All of these pieces combine to create one of the strongest transit systems out there, and it's easy to see that this has been successful. TransLink, the agency running all of these services, has enjoyed incredibly high ridership. So high, in fact, that Vancouver has the second highest per capita transit ridership in the US and Canada, second only to New York City. This success has created some growing pains, of course. Buses and trains are becoming more and more crowded, causing riders to complain, and it's clear that more service is needed on many key corridors. Buses are also becoming increasingly stuck in traffic as the region grows, leading riders to campaign for more and better bus lanes. However, TransLink has been generally enjoying a great success in terms of ridership and has seen great recovery since COVID, reaching 90% of pre-COVID ridership last September. Regardless of all their success, though, there is one huge problem. They have no money. A series of absolutely devastating articles and press releases from TransLink have outlined how the agency is facing a massive budget shortfall, somewhere around the ballpark of $600 million starting in 2026 if they maintain current service levels. For reference, the agency's total revenue in 2023 was $2.6 billion, meaning this is about a one-fourth reduction in available funds. This is a very dangerous fiscal cliff that TransLink is teetering on the edge of, and if they fall off, the consequences will be disastrous. These consequences will come from all sides of the agency and will impact everyone in the Metro Vancouver region, regardless of whether or not they currently ride transit. The first thing to go would be TransLink's non-transit services. The agency is currently charged with maintaining several roads and bridges in the Metro Vancouver region, which would be transferred to other government agencies. They are also charged with a lot of multimodal transportation work, including improvements to pedestrian and bicycle networks, which would be completely eliminated. However, the worst part of all of this is the impacts that would be made to transit services. TransLink currently operates over 230 transit lines, including countless bus routes of different types, 3 SkyTrain lines, the C-Bus, and the West Coast Express. Service reductions have already started, such as with the agency quote-unquote upgrading Route 2 to run with articulated buses, but also decreasing frequency from every 5 minutes to every 12 minutes. But things will get much, much worse across the entire network if new funding isn't found. TransLink has drafted 2 scenarios for service reduction in 2026 that would bring operations in line with the budget. Each of these would reduce about 50% of existing bus service, as well as some SkyTrain, C-Bus, and West Coast Express service. Both of these scenarios would also see a complete elimination of the night bus overnight bus network, as well as a 35% reduction in Handy Dart paratransit service, mostly limiting it to only medical appointments and no other trips for most customers. Scenario 1 focuses on maximizing ridership and maintains the busiest routes in the existing system, with the hopes of using that revenue to continue funding some operations. However, it would still be absolutely devastating to the system. Let's start with the non-bus modes. SkyTrain would see a 10% reduction, with peak and off-peak reductions in frequency and span of service, which is the hours per day that the service runs. Canada Line would see planned service improvements for 2025 cancelled. C-Bus would see span and peak frequency reduced, for an overall reduction of about 15% from existing service levels. The West Coast Express would only run 3 daily round trips, down from the current 5. However, these are small changes compared to the bus network. only 90 of the current 225 plus routes would remain. Entire cities and huge areas of others would lose all transit service entirely. These include the entire city of Maple Ridge, the majority of West and North Vancouver, all of South Delta and Ladner, and most of Langley and White Rock. Other cities would also see huge reductions in routes, with the only relatively unscathed places being Vancouver and parts of Burnaby and New Westminster. What's important to note is while this scenario would preserve the busiest routes in the system, many of these routes rely on connections from other services, as TransLink generally operates a grid-based network, with north-south and east-west lines connecting to each other, and lower ridership routes feeding into higher ridership ones. This means that the remaining routes would also face a significant decline in ridership. This would mean that about 675,000 people would lose access to transit within walking distance, and 265,000 jobs would no longer be accessible by transit. 21 to 33% of equity groups, which TransLink describes as low-income individuals, visible minorities, youth, and seniors, in other words, people most likely to be entirely dependent on transit, would lose service as well under this scenario. Scenario 2 is about as dire as Scenario 1, but focuses on maintaining coverage rather than ridership and trying to ensure as many people as possible can still walk to transit. Under this scenario, every city would have some level of service, but it would still be very limited. Frequency and span would also be reduced on these 85 remaining bus routes. Vancouver would lose more service under this scenario, with closely spaced busy bus routes being consolidated into the busiest corridors. This would allow places like West Vancouver, Maple Ridge, and Coquitlam to maintain some level of service, but still lose service to most of their neighborhood. In terms of non-bus modes, this scenario would be even harsher than the first. SkyTrain would see about a 30% reduction in service, both with frequency and span. SeaBus would also see a 30% reduction, with off-peak frequencies falling from 15 to 30 minutes and peak frequencies falling from 10 to 15 minutes. West Coast Express would be deleted entirely, with its funds reallocated to bus service. Service span on each route would also be reduced, with many bus routes ending at 8 p.m. instead of midnight or later under current operations. This would make it difficult or impossible for people with late shift jobs to make it to work by transit in many places. Under this scenario, about 500,000 people would lose access to transit within walking distance, along with 170,000 jobs and 17 to 24% of equity populations. So, under either scenario, over 500,000 people will lose access to transit. About a quarter of the equity populations within Metro Vancouver will lose access, and up to 250,000 jobs will no longer be transit accessible. These two scenario networks are, of course, not finalized and could change, but it's unlikely that there would be any solution that would reduce the number of people losing access to transit. This will have massive impacts for those who ride transit and those who don't. Those who ride transit will be forced to walk farther to reach transit, and once they get there, they will likely face more crowded vehicles due to reduced frequencies. They would also have to endure longer waits and schedule their days more carefully to ensure that they don't miss the last bus, train, or ferry of the night. However, many people will probably choose to abandon transit altogether, especially those left in areas without any bus service. This means that there will be significantly more cars on the region's already congested roads, increasing pollution, travel times, and more. This would undo significant progress made to reduce the number of cars on Vancouver streets, and would represent a massive step in the wrong direction in terms of car dependency. Additionally, the lower-income individuals losing access to transit would be forced to buy or share cars, placing an even bigger financial burden on those already struggling with the region's high cost of living. To make matters even worse, these service cuts wouldn't be easily reversible. TransLink would be forced to sell off excess buses, trains, and ferries in order to try and recoup some of the financial losses. They would also lay off countless operators, likely close to half of their workforce. The agency and municipalities would also remove bus stops from areas that would lose bus routes. This means that according to their estimates, it would take around 10 years to fully restore service to 2024 levels if funding were found at some point after the cuts. This would represent a catastrophic step backwards for the region's transportation system, and one that would have drastic, long-lasting effects. Transit in the region is already reaching capacity, and at a time when we desperately need to be expanding service, slashing it would have horrifying consequences. So, How did we get to such a dire position, and is there a way out? Basically, what it comes down to is how we fund transit, both at TransLink and at other larger transit agencies. TransLink relies on a variety of funding sources to pay for its services, but there are major issues with two of them. The first is fares. TransLink relies on fares for about a quarter of its income, but they have been making less money over time for the agency. The agency does do yearly fare increases, but these are capped below inflation levels to ensure affordability and accessibility for riders. Additionally, while ridership has recovered well since the COVID-19 pandemic, there are still gaps in ridership in many areas, and the years of lower pandemic ridership have made a significant dent in the bank account. The second issue is the gas tax. TransLink collects a flat fee on every liter of gas sold in Metro Vancouver, which makes this fee completely independent of gas prices or, crucially, how many people are buying gas. With a significant uptick in electric vehicle sales, the agency is seeing major reductions in the amount of money it gains from the gas tax. Another source is relief funding provided for the agency due to pandemic and other financial troubles, which is scheduled to run out in the near future. Finally, the agency is facing mounting pressures from inflation, which are causing it to see even higher costs of labor, fuel, parts, and more, causing the previous issues to be compounded even further. Unfortunately, this fiscal cliff situation is not unique to TransLink. BART in the San Francisco Bay Area and Chicago area's regional transit systems are both looking at huge fiscal cliffs, among other American agencies. There is only one thing in common between all of these systems and their funding structures. They are extremely reliant on fares to pay for their operations. While it may have worked in the past, it's clear that fare-based funding simply isn't sustainable for transit. Temporary drops in ridership, such as COVID-19, can cause death spirals for these agencies. In a death spiral, the agency sees a drop in ridership, which leads to reduced money to run service, which in turn leads to less service, which then leads to fewer riders using the service as it is lower quality, which then continues the cycle. This has been the case at many American transit agencies over the past few decades, as agencies see their service slowly decay, but it is even more apparent now with massive fiscal cliff situations. There are many other unstable transit funding sources like gas and sales taxes that can also cause similar situations or can even cause transit funding to be reduced when transit services are successful, as is the case with gas taxes. We need to come up with new and better ways to fund our transit systems, using methods that are sustainable and stable long term. We can't afford to have our transit systems collapse on us. Even in North America, where transit isn't the mode choice of most, we all need transit to reduce congestion, ensure essential workers can get to work, and ensure those who need the freedom to get around the most can have that freedom. So, how do we do it? First, we need to elect people who are willing to fund transit. A lot of TransLink's funding was planned and approved at a provincial level by the BC government. There is a BC provincial election later this year, which will have a massive impact on whether or not TransLink receives the funding it needs. It is essential that we back candidates who are willing and ready to fund transit, no matter what, and ensure that we can build and maintain systems that are usable and convenient for all riders and don't fall apart at a moment's notice. Once we've elected those with the willpower to fund transit, we need more sustainable funding sources. Sources like gas taxes, sales taxes, and fares are all extremely volatile. Sales taxes and fares can also be inequitable, with lower-income individuals paying a much greater portion of their incomes into funding services than those with higher incomes. So, we should ideally also move to a more progressive funding system that taxes those who can afford to pay more. With that, there are a few main ideas. First, the gas tax wasn't a horrible plan. It just never planned on electric vehicles. We could implement vehicle usage fees that go towards funding transit to ensure car owners pay their fair share. We could also implement tolls on bridges and busy roads, which would be especially easy for TransLink as they already own many of these facilities. This would allow car drivers to pay for the space they take up and pay for the maintenance of these spaces, as well as for transit service for those who are unable to drive or choose not to. This could even be expanded into a form of congestion pricing, which would be especially effective in congested cities like Vancouver, and used to generally reduce car dependency overall. However, all of these sources are very reliant on economic conditions and mode choices, and somewhat incentivize car use as a means of paying for our transit systems, so we need more options. One solution that's been proposed is a property tax increase, which would only need to be a very small amount considering the size and relative wealth of Metro Vancouver. However, this does rely on the notoriously unstable housing market to fund transit, and it does effectively encourage unaffordable housing in order to fund transit, so it may not be the most ideal solution. One place we can look at is Hong Kong, where the local transit system works with developers to develop buildings on and around its rail stations. This means that agencies like TransLink could use their land to their advantage, building new buildings near high-capacity transit lines and stations. This would not only fund transit, but would create transit-oriented developments and further reduce car dependency. Agencies could also grant permits to private developers and maintain ownership of the land that is built on, charging the developers and landlords lease money for their buildings. Transit could also receive funding from income taxes, ensuring that those with higher incomes pay more to fund these systems. Finally, the federal governments of the US and Canada both need to step up and provide more funding for transit. Historically, the U.S. government provided funding to both build transit and buy vehicles through capital programs as well as operational money, allowing agencies to run service. However, that funding was slowly decreased and cut by the turn of the millennium, forcing agencies to rely on funding from more volatile local sources. Re-implementing federal funding for transit operations would ensure a more stable source of transit revenue and would allow agencies to worry less about economic downturns, changes in people's lifestyles, and other factors that impact transit funding today. Funding transit is always a good move, and not having a strong transit system is bad for everyone. According to the American Public Transportation Association, every dollar invested into transit can turn into $5 of economic development in the area invested in, and transit systems ensure that everyone, even those who can't or won't drive, can get around. This is incredibly important, and the fact that so many of our transit systems are on the brink of failure is shocking and dangerous. We need to be providing funding for agencies like TransLink to keep on doing the work they're doing and to allow them to expand services where needed to continue their vital role of reducing car dependency, increasing equity, and boosting economies. So, my fingers are very much crossed for TransLink, and I'm very hopeful that someone will find a way to fund their operations and expansion well into the future. Let's hope that all transit agencies are able to find funding solutions that are more sustainable and stable. If you can, get involved in your local community and push for better transit funding options. Be vocal and get your voice out there to ensure you can keep moving around using a high-quality transit system for the rest of your life.